So I am so deeply honored to announce and moderate this next session. Brain blank, long day. I am honored, though. We're here. So the point of any of this work, right, in the end, is to help build a better world together. And we have three speakers that are truly three of my research scholar heroes in terms of the work they are truly doing to make the world a more compassionate, present, kind place. So we're going to hear about their work from three very different angles that all are working toward this goal. So first, we'll hear from Sujatha Baliga about her work in restorative justice and bringing deep, mindful listening to these contexts and the transformative interactions that can occur when that is brought into that space. Then we'll hear from Amishi Jha, who's going to tell us about the work that she's doing with mindfulness training in high-demand populations in very practical, accessible ways to alleviate the suffering that these people encounter and help them do their jobs more effectively. And then finally, we're going to wrap it up by in from Nava Levit Benoon, who is here to tell us about her work on mindfulness and meditation research in not social justice, in peace-building contexts, and how bringing in this contemplative perspective can help us move toward actual reconciliation and connection, even in these high conflict situations. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and hand over the floor. And thank you all for being with us for what I think is going to be a really special end to the day. So Sujatha, please come up.
Thank you, Alea, and thank you, Cliff, and the whole Center for Mind and Brain, and everyone here. And thank you for hanging in, especially those of you in other time zones. It is a long day for us, and an even longer one in some ways for y'all. So thank you so much. My name is Sujatha Baliga, and I would like for us, I know that we just caffeinated ourselves, those of us in the room, and had our donuts, which is really an important part of the day, definitely, especially at this point. But I would also like for us to just take a moment and check in with our bodies and our breath. And so if you want to just see where you want to pay, in particular, attention, if there's some place that you're noticing in your body that needs a little love, maybe there's some tension you're holding, some discomfort you're feeling. Maybe roll out your shoulders if that's where you're holding it. Maybe even just put your hands where it is. Maybe there's some tension in your belly. Where it is that you want to put your hands, just give a little attention to those places. Now let's take a moment to be with the breath. Maybe you notice your belly rising and falling. If you're noticing your breath in your chest, maybe you might try your belly as a place to soften and let it go deeper. Or maybe you really enjoy noticing the sensation of your breath in your nostrils or above your upper lip. And let's take a moment to be really grateful for the breath. As we're feeling it come and go, remembering that our breath is our oldest and dearest friend. It's been here since our very first breath. And we'll be here until our very last. Our breath is our best friend, our most non-judgmental friend, giving us precious information about our current state of mind. It's telling us lots of stuff we can see if it's short or deep and long, whether it's jagged or measured. The breath is just letting us know without any sense of judgment. How wonderful. So let's just take a moment to be grateful for the breath. And then come back into the space. If your eyes have been closed, maybe open them. And how about look around even and maybe look at somebody. Notice that they're here too. So many people to be grateful for, and maybe scrolling around within the Zoom windows to see, if not faces, names. Just be grateful for the company, the camaraderie, and this beautiful day we've spent together. So my name is Sujata Balaga, and something that I have learned from the many indigenous people that I have had the incredible blessing of learning my restorative justice and peacemaking work from is that they don't do land acknowledgements. And there are many people who are grateful that we do, but that's not the way they start their things, right? There's a lot of time spent in talking about your lineage, like where you are from, to whom you are beholden, who you come from, who you're obligated to. And so I really love that as a practice, in part because it keeps me true to whom I am obligated. So long before the dawn of quantum mechanics, indigenous folks and the Buddha too knew that there's no such thing as objectivity. So before sharing what we think and believe and know, it's considered useful to say a bit about my orientation, my history, my vantage point. And but I'd like to also ask you all to pause for a second and think about what lenses you see things through. Maybe they're formative parts of your history, or maybe there are subjects you have studied and loved. What is it in your life and your thinking that has brought the piece of the kaleidoscope that we are collectively seeing through into this room? So just take a moment to contemplate that. As a favor to me, in part, also, before I share mine. And then I would ask, just for some, to spend some time in the next few days noticing if there is some way in which what you have learned, where you've come from, what you have been taught in formal and informal classrooms that we walk through every day, what do you bring to the kaleidoscope that we are all seeing together? So my Maori friends from Aotearoa, also known as New Zealand, do something called a whakapapa at the beginning of meetings, and it really is this request of asking, what was your canoe? What was the mountain that your people came from? What canoe brought you to where? And so that is a really beautiful exercise that I had to learn to say, like, oh, my father actually came on a boat. And his people came from here, but oh, the Goan Konkani people actually went through Bihar from the Himalaya originally, and what were we taught? And so that was a really beautiful process. So I know that is a place of great privilege, and that there are many of us who do not have the capacity to know that those histories have been stolen. But there may be some things that you can know. And so I would encourage people to go on that journey and to learn more about that. To learn to whom are we connected, to whom are we obligated, how might that impact what information you receive and how you receive it, just so we have like that brings the kaleidoscopic picture into greater focus. So in Oakland, we're often asked in the restorative justice circles that I'm in, let's say I'm sitting in a healing circle with students who are at risk of being pushed out of school, or young people who are at risk of being criminalized. And one of the questions that's often asked, in order again to build that trust and that understanding of who is in this circle and what are they bringing to our kaleidoscope, is the question, whose shoulders do you stand on? And I remember the first time I heard that, it immediately brought up my cultural lens, which disturbed me to listen to people talking about standing on the shoulders of their elders, because for me, we don't put our feet on our elders, we touch our elders' feet. And so that was just this beautiful, like, wow, these are just such gorgeous ways to say the same things. And so I talk more about whose feet I touch. And so for me, I am deeply indebted to Mennonite people who coined the term, particularly Howard Zehr, who coined the term restorative justice, and to various indigenous people the world over in the different forms of peacemaking and non-punishment oriented approaches to healing harm and conflict, particularly Maori folks, and to Diné or Navajo peacemakers, who I'll be speaking about a little bit today, and a little bit about my own personal history. So I was raised in rural Pennsylvania, and then back and forth between rural Pennsylvania and urban India in the 1970s and 80s, in a Hindu family that is of a lineage of Hinduism that puts Buddha most prominently on our altar. And so that is a little bit of, I think, what ultimately drew me to become Buddhist and practice the contemplative practices within the lineage in which I practice. A little bit about me too. My friends joke that I should have the words trigger warning tattooed across my forehead because I do a lot of work as a survivor, a public survivor of various forms of harm, which I will not be discussing in detail, but I will name them, and that is a huge part of what has brought me to the work of criminal justice reform. I'm a survivor of child sexual abuse in my own home, and of other forms of domestic and intimate partner violence, as well as rape in my early 20s. And I grew up living in fear, not just inside my home, but in many ways more so outside my home. The amount of daily, quotidian violence that I lived with really has shaped my view of life in the United States before we understood things were bullying, and I know that I bring that lens to the work that I do. My rage about all the things that were terribly wrong, both in my life and in the world, is what has also driven me to the work that I do today. And it also drove me to rock bottom in my early 20s when I was at that time living in India and trying to work with Nepali girls who had been trafficked. Young girls who'd been trafficked. And I had a breakdown and went on a journey by myself and ended up in Dharamshala, where through an unbelievable course of events that's too much to talk about today, got to have an hour with His Holiness the Dalai Lama when I was 24 years old. And he gave me perfect advice in a perfect way about how it is that I might forgive my father for the decade of sexual abuse that I endured. And so this was just months before I was about to start law school to become, no, I've got it right here. Thank you, Cliff, thanks. To start law school where I had planned to become a prosecutor to lock all the people like my father up. My father had passed away when I was 16, and this incapacity due to his departure to resolve things with him directly meant that I was going to save the whole planet by being a prosecutor. Well, I followed His Holiness's advice. I forgave my father, and the fire that was there that was going to lead me to put people behind bars forever was gone. And I started law school with no clue as to what to do, and ultimately actually ended up becoming a criminal defense attorney, a death penalty lawyer, having left victim advocacy for this work, and ultimately found that every aspect that I had touched in the criminal legal system, whether I had been working with the Department of Justice or working as a defense attorney, working as a victim advocate, every single piece of it was wildly ineffective, and that if I really wanted every single being who is touched by this system to heal and to do better in life than they are currently doing, we needed to find a new way. Well, what I learned through my contact with all these wonderful people that I have just mentioned, that there's a new way that could be fashioned out of old ways. And so that's what my journey has been. I've also been practicing various forms of Buddhist meditation for the past 27 years, and these days you'll find me at the Gyurto Foundation, which is a Tibetan Buddhist monastery and temple in the Richmond Hills, where I lead secular meditation on Monday nights. That is what I'm doing in addition to writing a book and still trying to help folks who are building the restorative justice movement. So that's a little bit about whose feet I touch and whose shoulders I stand on. Let me see if I can get this to advance. Oh, there we go. we're good, thanks. You just had to stand up, Cliff, and it just happened magically. So, it's magic. So, the lived experiences that bring me to this work, as I mentioned, the system is an abject failure. Here's some conservative data about 100 incidents of child sexual abuse, depending on the state and what system you're looking at. 10 to 18 are reported to anybody, 6 maybe are prosecuted, 3 are convicted, and of those who are convicted, it is often for something that someone has pled to, not the thing that was actually done, right? And so, and sometimes that's in either direction, right? As a defense attorney, my clients had taken plea deals because they knew that they were going to get railroaded if they went to trial, and so they took a plea deal that they were railroaded into. So it's not, I'm not trying to imply that people get away with stuff all the time. If anything, I know far too many people who've spent, say, 27 years in prison for a crime they did not commit at all, to ever want to imply that it's in one direction or another. So there is a massive human cost to mass incarceration. That number is not exactly accurate anymore. It's not 2.2 million humans in cages. It's about 2 million right now because COVID, we did do some emptying, but it's building back up again. And you know, when we study punishment in law school, right, one of the first things you learn on the first day of law school, in criminal law class, they say, why do we punish? It's usually the beginning of this theoretical discussion. And there are these 4 reasons they give you. The first is incapacitation. They say that we want to keep people incapacitated, but most sentences are actually pretty short. And so we're not incapacitating people for very long, right? And it also denies the reality that when you put a person in a detention facility, there are other humans in those detention. So from whom are they being incapacitated? Who's the we and the us that we are concerned with? Apparently not the other people who they're incarcerated with, right? Prisons are not particularly safe places to be. Another reason is rehabilitation. Well, we know from our data that the criminal legal system does not rehabilitate folks very well. If anything, if we had a system designed for safety that had a 40 to 60% failure rate, that wouldn't be on the market, right? We wouldn't want that as like our home security device, right? So why do we accept that from the criminal legal system? And relatedly, deterrence is another reason we say that we do this. And again, there's studies after studies that show that the criminal legal system is not an effective deterrent. Like that's not why people don't commit crimes. And so that's not, it's not a very effective. And if, I'm not gonna make you do a show of hands, but it is interesting how many people in this room have done something that is illegal, right? And I mean, I will raise my hand. Many, many things that have been illegal I have done. And yeah, the law just really wasn't a deterrent for a good Indian girl like me. So that, is very interesting to me. And then, so the 4th reason that we rely on punishment is retribution. That is an explicit goal of punishment. And so that one's actually happening, like 1 out of 4, right? But the question has always called to my heart, is that an independent good? Is that an independent good? And what is interesting when I look back on my own childhood, I actually never really wanted my father to be locked up or punished in any way. I just really wanted it to stop. So I wanted to try to find a safety device that wasn't making us less safe. And it's not just mass incarceration, it's also mass criminalization, right? If you look at this pie, and we're talking about the 2 million who are incarcerated, that's only those first 3 little pieces, right? The vast majority of folks for whom we are spending billions and billions of dollars to place under some form of correctional control that results in their stigmatization and facing limiting life choices that derail their futures and make it more likely that we are putting them in the revolving door of recidivism. That it's actually probation and parole that is that leads to about 9 million people in the United States who are currently under correctional control. So since all of these aspects, right, for the folks who've experienced harm, for the folks who've caused harm, that the system was not working, I really felt like it was, there had to be a better way. So what is restorative justice? I want to introduce you to Justice Robert Yazzie. He's the former Chief Justice of the Navajo Nation and like an uncle to me now and a great teacher. He left the practice of sort of a Western-inspired law, which is what the courts in Navajo land look like, because that's how you get the grants, because you have to replicate Western courts in order to get funding to run your courts in Navajo country. There's something called the 18 Major Crimes Act, which says that you can't have courts on Navajo land that handle these 18 major crimes. And so Justice Yazzie became interested in the Diné ways of peacemaking and left the bench to become a peacemaker. And so he is one of my teachers. He says that peacemaking and restorative justice are very close cousins and that they're undefinable. He says that when you think about what is restorative justice, you want to think that life comes from it. Or he also says things like, it's about moving forward in a good way. And then he spends a lot of time explaining the medicine wheel, and he talks about like start from the east and walk clockwise, and all of these beautiful things that make that take a lot longer to explain and often can't be put into words. But it is really about being in reciprocal obligation with all my relations, even folks who've done incredibly terrible things, and that we remain bound to one another, and we have to find a way to move forward in a good way. My other teacher is someone who's known as the grandfather of restorative justice. His name is Howard Zehr, and he's the one who coined the terms and has done the most amazing seminal writing and thinking in the field of restorative justice. He's a Mennonite man who spent his early years as an academic in historically black colleges and universities. He is the first, I think, white person to have graduated from Morehouse himself in the early 1960s, decided that the way to understand what was going on with racism in America was to go to Morehouse, and so, and he's just an incredibly humble and brilliant person. This is his definition of restorative justice. He says it's an approach to justice that involves, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific harm or offense, and to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to put things as right as possible. And so Howard, in the first major text he wrote on the topic, it's called Changing Lenses, and he says that restorative justice requires a fundamental paradigm shift. And he's deeply influenced by Thomas Kuhn and his Structures of Scientific Revolution, and that's what the whole beginning of his book is about. Well, that happened to be my favorite book before I ever learned of the field of restorative justice, and so I was hooked from like the first few pages of his text. So what's the paradigm shift that Howard calls us to in this work? He says that the current criminal legal system calls us to answer these three questions. This is what happens when we have a wrongdoing in our society. What law was broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished? That's not just true in our justice systems, it's also true in our schools, right? What rule was broken and what should happen to this kid now, you know, or sometimes in our homes, right? We have our rules and like, you broke this rule and this is what's going to be the punitive consequence for your behavior, with the hopes that that kind of thing will be a deterrent for future behavior, right? That's how many of us parent. So the paradigm shift that Howard calls us to in restorative justice asks a very different set of questions. It asks, who was harmed? And what do they need? And whose obligation is it to meet those needs? So in thinking about that, I would just ask folks for a moment, and maybe you want to pop the chat up if that's easy right now, for people to think about a time, not the worst thing that ever happened to you, and to think about a time in which you experienced harm, when someone, not like an ouch kind of situation, but like something that felt like an injustice, something really not okay that happened to you. And think about what you needed. What did you need? And so if you would put in the chat, if that's easy, not the thing that happened, not like how you were harmed or what the harm was, but rather just what did you need? And you can write things like respect or to have been heard, right? Like those kinds of things. And if folks in the room just want to contemplate it, you know, what did you need? What did you need? And think about what did you need then, and maybe even pop some things in there. What do you need now? Is there something you still need now? And then I think that I would ask us to also think about a time in which you caused harm. So every single person in this room has caused harm at some point in their lives. Someone has done something about which they are not proud, right? It may not have risen to some very extreme level, but there's something we remember that we did that was not okay. And what I would ask is, what did you need then, leading up to it or in the moment? And what do you need now? And so folks want to populate the chat with that too, just the thing you needed. And again, really generic stuff like, you know, to have been listened to have been believed, those kinds of things, right? So if we were doing a day-long workshop on restorative justice, what I would do is I would ask you to write these things on 2 different colored Post-it notes, and then we would find areas of commonality, where we would say, there's a whole wing of the wall over here where all the Post-it notes are about being listened to, and you would see both colors of Post-it notes saying the exact same thing, right? You would see both colors of Post-it notes, and then there are things that are complementary things, like to have asked for forgiveness, to have forgiven, right? And those Post-it notes in different people's handwritings, but it's really moving when it's the same handwriting. Like there are times in our lives when we've needed both sides of this thing. So that's a little bit about where we're going with restorative justice. I think that this slide, thanks, you can, yes, thank you, go back to this. So to whom and what do we attend? I think this, for me as a survivor of violence and harm, felt most drawn to restorative justice because it actually centered me, not the person who caused the harm, right? It's not that they're not in the picture, because that third question, whose obligation is it to meet those needs, is the question about true accountability. And so that's where we want to end up. So, you know, the big picture is that crime is a violation of people and interpersonal relationships. And I put crime in quotation marks because I'm not personally wedded to Western notions of transgressions of law. I'm more interested in, you know, the harm that occurs between people in interpersonal relationships. Those violations create obligations, and the central obligation is to, as much as possible, do right by the folks you've harmed. So in practice, what does that look like? It looks like often sitting in a circle, sitting in a direct dialogue with the people, everyone impacted, including the person who's caused harm and experienced harm. You can learn more about it by looking up the Restorative Justice Project at Impact Justice. It's my previous organization where we do diversion work nationally, helping district attorneys select categories of felony level harm that young people do, and setting up programs where they're diverted pre-charge into an opportunity to meet directly with the person that they've harmed, with family and community coming together to produce a plan to repair the harm, which when completed, no charges are ever filed. I'm also, and you can learn more at rjdtoolkit.org about how we do that work. They do that work. I'm no longer there. And the other thing I'm working on right now is called the Collective Healing and Transformation Project. This is a community-based organization that is working with people who are experiencing intimate partner, sexual, and domestic violence, who do not want to call the police in the first place. A lot of folks, immigrant folks, are reticent to engage the system. 50% of survivors of domestic violence do not contact the system. Of those who do, 20% say it made them less safe. And so that is why we are, those are Department of Justice statistics. So we want to be able to, some people are like, we need to make the system better, and I'm like, we also need another thing that doesn't involve the system. So that is my work. So I'm going to talk briefly about sort of 3 key similarities that I'm seeing between, so I sort of used to, particularly when I was working with district attorneys, prosecutors, I would wear a suit and I would bring in my lawyer self, and I wouldn't really talk about what I was actually doing in these processes, which was like all about like my grounding in the Buddha Dharma. Then I was not gonna try to both get them to do this thing and understand how it works, right? So I kept that sort of on the DL. But there are some significant similarities. The list could be much, much longer, and I hope someday to write a book about something that I would like to call the law's middle way. But these are 3 of the key ones that I've been thinking about of late, that there's key similarities between contemplative practices and restorative justice. 3 things that get drawn out: equanimity, contemplative presence, and interdependence. So the first one is about equanimity. So restorative justice facilitators, those of us who hold the space, are holding with equal compassion those who've caused harm, those who've experienced harm, and the families and communities of both of those people. And we do our best to bring them all together. And so this is not this mediator's neutrality, right? It is very clear that someone has done something wrong, sometimes terribly, terribly wrong, and they need to be held accountable. But that is not intended as punishment. That's intended as repair of the relationships that were broken by this act, of the needs of the person who has experienced the harm and of the person who caused the harm, that there's repair that needs to happen there too. And at that point, we're looking at causes and conditions that gave rise to that harm, and how do we work with those circumstances to set someone up for success moving forward. The ethic behind it is sort of all boats rise with the tide. And in some ways, in my prep work, I do a little bit of that just like me meditation, which some of you may be familiar with. It's this idea of building a feeling of connection with the other side. Before we bring people together, like, can we embrace the common humanity with the folks that we currently see as the enemy, right? And so doing a little bit of that work up front really helps us grow our chops to be in the circle together. And really growing our capacity to have the strength, particularly as facilitators, and family members of the folks who caused the harm, especially those who sort of are accustomed to letting people get away with it, to build in a feeling of loving accountability. This, I want you to not suffer being less than who I know you to be. Right? I want you to become your best self. That is what accountability looks like. So the next thing, the next commonality is the sense of contemplative presence, right? What is that deep, sacred kind of listening that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about when in his book Anger, he writes about this, just letting people fully share what has happened. That is, to my mind, the most transformative thing that happens in a restorative justice process. And so you can see President Obama here in a circle in Chicago offering that kind of listening. It makes me think about His Holiness the Dalai Lama, for those of us who've been in his presence. Why do they call him Kundun, right? It's present. The word means presence, and they mean it, of course, as like a the presence of Avalokiteshvara here on earth, but I also receive it in a secular way, like he's so present to what you are saying. And that in and of itself is radically healing. When you are talking about what happened, when all ears and eyes are on you, and there are certain practices that allow for that, that set you up for that, the talking piece, for example, going hand through hand through hand, asking a singular question and allowing people to answer, like even a question like, what happened? And everyone shares at great depth and length. And then it comes back around again, and people maybe respond to each other. And then the third time it goes around, the answers really start to deepen. And the fourth time it goes around, something starts to happen that, to my mind, is, a little bit about what I've been thinking about is the way it toggles in the same way that deep meditative practices do. So for those who are practicing the kinds of meditative practice where you are trying to have single-pointed concentration on something like compassion or loving kindness or generosity or even emptiness, whatever it is that you are, and you are staying with that experience, and then there's an epiphany. And the point of epiphany becomes the new object of meditation. And you stay with that for a really long time, and then there's another epiphany, and then that becomes the new, and it just drops in and drops in and drops in. That's what it feels like when the talking piece is going around. That's what a real restorative justice process feels like when, I think, well facilitated. So that alternating is a really powerful experience, and the not interrupting and the listening and the being present and allowing. And when we have epiphanies together, that co-epiphany experience causes something to re-regulate within us, that collective experience of the co-epiphanies with the people who had been our enemies really leads us towards a point where something pops over into solutions land. And now we're ready to start talking about what happens. Okay, so The third thing that I think is a real similarity is these notions of interdependence, interbeing, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, Ubuntu. This is the actual epiphany that happens for a whole lot of folks, right? This notion, Ubuntu, is this idea of a person is a person through other people, or I am because we are. When we really start to see the multiple causes and conditions that gave rise to the situation on both quote unquote sides, right? What had made this person vulnerable to victimization? What had made this person, what structures are in place that allowed that to occur? What happened in this person's life that allowed them to go down this not great road? When we start to feel all of that together, we really feel what, to my mind, feels like, and it requires family and community all being able to weigh in on what they see on this. It can't just be like a mediated dialogue between two people. That is insufficient for this magic to happen. It needs all of us. It needs grandma. It needs your best friends. Like, we had a circle for my son recently about some stuff going on with him, and calling in his friends, calling in his favorite uncles. Like, everybody had to be in the circle, right? And it was much less what my spouse and I were saying, and far more what these young people and Uncle Greg was saying. That was really important for all of them to be there. And so that starts to feel like what this overlay is on this picture is Indra's net, this notion that there's an infinite, multi-dimensional web that has at every juncture a gemstone with an infinite number of facets. And so what does that mean? Each one is reflected in every other one, in every direction, right? And so what does that mean? It means that if there's something harmful that is happening, it doesn't matter how far away. It is actually impacting my little corner of the web. And when something gorgeous is happening in my corner of the web, it is going to reflect out everywhere else as well. So I'm going to breeze through the rest of these slides. Restorative justice has a lot of measurable success. We've shown in both randomized control trials and in comparative matched samples over the course of several years, a 44% reduction in recidivism. Even if we're measuring that by arrest, which I'm not a fan of using because kids of color get arrested just for being kids of color, so I don't think that's a good measure. But even if that's the case, 33% reduction in recidivism, 91 victim satisfaction rate. We don't have a comparative analysis with the criminal legal system because guess what? They don't keep track of that data. There's an assumption made that a conviction is satisfactory, which, even if that were. Anyway, okay, so significant cost savings as well, obviously. And so really briefly on paradigm shift, once upon a time we believed that the Earth was in the middle of our solar system. But nah, actually it was the sun, and people were really punished for thinking that. I think of the world today as our punitiveness in the carceral state as being this flawed view, and that the three cousins, as our dear friend Cheryl Fairbanks says, she is an Indigenous peacemaker, Indigenous peacemaking, restorative justice, transformative justice are the cousins that I think of as this heliocentric paradigm, this non-punitive approach to true accountability. And so these two things went on for 200 years, right? When you look back at the history of this debate that was going on in science, 200 years people are arguing about this stuff. So of course, there's this incredible urgency for us to get it right. And at the same time, it feels important to say that maybe this won't get seen in our lifetimes. But I take heart in this quote, that the seed never sees the flower. Maybe our efforts are cave paintings. It's important for the research to be done, the reports to be written, the instructions to be left for the young people who are so brilliant these days, who are going to take it all the way to the next level. And then we can, like Justice Yazzie says, get to a good place in a good way. And I also love this quote, which is, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." That's Arundhati Roy. And so I'm going to take another breath. And do we have time for Q&A, or we can keep it moving? Okay, so let's take one more breath and just say thank you again to the breath for being with us through this whole presentation. Thank you to everybody. And yeah.
Thank you so much. I myself have 1,000 things I want to say and 1,000 questions, but I want to turn it over to y'all. So do we have any questions in the room that you'd like to bring, or discussion points, things coming up? Oh, many. We've not heard from Frank yet, actually. Frank, did you have a chance to ask a question? Okay, let's go over to Deepu. You did, but it wasn't a question. Well, you know.
What a wonderful talk. I was seeing a lot of connections with Paul's work on relational stuff, and new to the contemplative science area. I'm struggling understanding the fullness of what's happening in these circles, right? Like it's about more into the space, it feels like. But on the other hand, when other people are talking about contemplative science, it's about emptiness, right? And in some ways, and my superficial thinking of it, those seem polar opposites to each other. But on the other hand, I bet there's more connections between the space. So I'm just wondering about the space between filling with so many viewpoints and identities on one hand, but then also trying to foster a sense of, I don't know if emptiness is the right word, but I think that's the word I'm going to use.
I like goosebumps. Wow. Deepu, you're like literally asking for like an answer to like dependent origination and empty of inherent existence. I mean, this is like the deepest stuff that could, so there is and let me see if I can do it in a really succinct way. That in the lineage that I practice in, right? So I come to this work as a Buddhist and not as a mindfulness person necessarily, right? So that's the only way I can answer the question. And so a very, very cursory understanding of it is like, so if there's a pen, right, there are infinite causes and conditions that gave rise to this pen's existence, right? Like what causes plastic to exist, and who are the people who like made the pen and their parents, all the way back to the Big Bang, right? And the everything in this pen is infinite causes and conditions, right? And so it is dependently originated. Its existence is dependent upon infinite causes and conditions, and so that makes it empty of inherent existence. That is what I have been taught is the meaning. And in addition to that, it requires a mind that is labeling it a pen. So it is so there's also an element of dependent designation of the thing. And that is at the root of the deepest thing I think that happens in restorative justice processes is this fundamental understanding of change, of the temporariness of things. And this relates to the talk on language too. It's like, we try not to use labeling language. You never heard me say the word offender, et cetera, right? Because it is in Navajo, all of these indigenous languages, most of them are verb-based. So instead of saying there's a woman sitting there, it is womaning is happening over there, right? Which is, we're in a constant state of change. And that allows my father to not be locked in time as a child molester, me to be locked in time as a victim, and everything can change. And so at the deepest level, that is what happens. But in the circle itself, it's like, what happened? What did you do? What do you need to know? What are the details that need to come out? How has the harm impacted you? What do you need in order to turn your life around? And in those conversations, the feeling, the understanding of all the causes and conditions that gave rise to this thing diffuses the notion of the fixedness of a crime and a criminal, and it makes it, we are in flux and flow. And that flux and flow can point us towards healing.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujata. We have arrived at interdependent origination, which is the best way to spend a Friday. So I'm pretty happy with all of it. No Zoom questions. Okay, so we have space for another question in the room. Let's hear from someone we haven't heard from yet. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I have a friend who's involved in restorative justice program here in Davis, and the question she's never been able to answer for me is, just on a practical level, not deeply philosophic, someone in the existing justice system has to decide when an offense could be better served through restorative justice. How is that demarcation made, and how is it going to move in the future as we expand these concepts into our existing system?
Yeah, this is a beautiful question. Thank you very much. And this is so much of my work, and my lawyer hat comes back on. Like, I try not to have to take off my Buddhist hat to do this, but it is. So what it is that district attorneys have discretion about whether or not they can divert cases, and where there is discretion, there is discrimination. That is something that has been shown by Federal Sentencing Commission data. And at the same time, discretion tends to lean towards leniency, but more so for white folks. Like, that is what the data shows. So it is very dangerous to put the onus on the decision makers to choose cherry pick which cases, because we know who they're going to cherry pick. And that has historically been the case with all diversion programs in the United States. So what we have been doing with a handful of progressive district attorneys across the nation is to pre-select cases that are guaranteed to attend to youth of color who have committed harms. And so everyone who's committed this crime with this many priors or whatever is automatically eligible for restorative justice. That is the way my work works. That is what I try to do with district attorneys. And I took this lesson from New Zealand, where their youth justice system is, restorative justice is automatic, and the district attorneys have to actually go to court to say that it needs to be taken out of restorative justice. So that's, a dream direction that we would move in. And it's my hope that doing things like keeping track of this kind of data that shows that this is actually in the public safety to do it this way. So I've got like 12 DAs across the nation right now that my former team, not I, they have 12 DAs across the nation right now who have got DAs who are willing to do it this way. And the data is starting to prove similar levels of success, that when you automatically send cases, serious cases, car theft, teen dating violence, some teen dating violence, burglaries, robberies, like serious crimes, to restorative justice, the outcomes are much better. And if you just send it without cherry picking, it's best. So you got to find the DAs who are willing to give up their discretion, which is one of the things that, it's like one of the best things about being a DA, right? So you get to have all kinds of discretion about stuff. So, but there's some pretty amazing DAs around the country who are willing to do it this way. So I feel grateful for that.
Thank you. I think that's actually a pretty hopeful note to end on, if we have DAs being willing to give up their discretion to go into these processes. So thank you. And do we have a question online? Okay, well, we'll make time for it. Hi, Eve.
Hi, Eve.
Hugs.
Hi there. I know I'm huge. It's kind of terrifying.
Huge Eve. Big Eve hug.
Thank you so much, and to the organizers and you, Sujata, for being there today. We've just been like nodding our heads and just feeling a lot of resonance with what you're offering. And I think my question, well, A, like, where do I pre-order your book? And then B, how can we bring this into the conflicts in our everyday lives so that this process feels alive for all of us, not for those who are, facing charges of one kind or another, but something that can really come alive and we know how to work with. And, Dharma circles, right, yep, where there's conflicts, yeah, academic settings where there's conflicts. Yep. So I just love to hear your thoughts on, how we make this alive in everyone's life.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the question, Eve. We're kind of a restorative justice circle kind of family. Like, every night at dinner, there is what was your rose? What was your thorn? What's your bud? Every night at dinner, right? Anytime there is conflict or harm in our family, we circle up. My husband and I, if anybody starts to raise their voice, our wedding vows are actually hanging in our living room. And we go over there and we read them out loud, and then we sit down and we take turns speaking and answering, and we bring in our friends and we do circles with our friends. Like, one of our friends went through a couple went through a lengthy divorce, and we did circles with them. And so, and for months and months, and I feel like for those of us who got to be those couples in those spaces, we got to deepen our own understandings of our own marriages. And I feel like that decoupling happened in a really good way because we were, as a community, having this front row, not even front row seat, we were deeply engaged in having it happen in a good way. So how does that happen? I mean, so restorative justice is everywhere. All kinds of trainings happen about circles, et cetera. It's wonderful. It's really wonderful if you can learn from indigenous folks. I have deep concerns about things that have happened in the restorative justice movement space that have been appropriation of indigenous people's practices. So there are tons of indigenous people around wherever you live who may be so kind as to offer you some teachings on what are some of these practices, and more importantly, the values that undergird them. And so you can start to bring them into your own life and work. So So lots of resources are out there. Start to practice. If anything, before you start to go try to change a criminal legal system, right? For years and years, we were just doing it ourselves in our own little organization, where I got my start, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth. And the acronym is RJOY. And in RJOY, long before we tried to like go do it with anybody else, we were doing it amongst ourselves, right? And so if you're not walking the talk, you're not going to be offering it in a good way to anybody else. So that is what I would say. Thank you for that question, Eve. It really has transformed my life to be able to have these kinds of processes when I'm in crisis or when I'm in celebration, to bring it. And that's the other thing I would say. If you're doing circles, if you're doing any other kind of process that has a restorative justice flavor to it, do it for the good times too. Or it just becomes like people become afraid of the circle, right? And so you wanna learn to do that deep contemplative thinking and being present for one another about your joys, not just your sorrows. So that's what I would say about that. And I know we have gone over. I appreciate you all very much. Thanks so much, folks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we'll bring up Dr. Amishi Jha to speak with us about her work on mindfulness training in kind of high-intensity professions.
All right, well, great to be here. I was really inspired by so much of what I heard today, and especially wanted to comment on what Sujatha said. She mentioned the Maori people, New Zealand, and describing the mountain you come from and the canoe you rode in on. So I would like to say a little bit about my mountain and canoe. My mountain is actually a really flat place called Davis, and my canoe is the Mangan Lab. So I was actually trained in cognitive neuroscience here at Davis. I started my Ph.D. 30 years ago with Ron Mangan. And so what I'm going to share with you today is what's happened since, in some sense. I study the neuroscience of attention, and just to give you a little bit of background, I spent the early part of my career, obviously in a very rigorous manner, learning how it is that attention works using brain imaging technologies to probe the basic mechanisms of attention. And then in my early years of my own lab, I started looking into some of the ways in which attention can fail us, and really what we can do, what happens in the laboratory setting to perturb attention functioning well. And this was around the time 9/11 was happening, in the early 2000s. And something happened around then where I felt like we had a pretty good sense of what was going on. Obviously, the mechanisms of attention is an ongoing problem space, or else Ron would never grant to write in 10 days. And methods by which we understand that attention can be compromised is also an ongoing journey. But what happened in the early days right after 9/11 was that actually in a school nearby where I lived at that point in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, there was a school shooting, and this was at a small school, and they thought that the person who had shot these children was a veteran. And we were at a time point where we had, we were in the surge of the wars that time in Afghanistan actively, and then Iraq was on the horizon. And I had this sense of sort of like impatience as a member of the civilian community and a scientist. And what tools did I have to actually have something I do matter for what was happening around me? How might my science help the situation? So that longing to do something to help a suffering world, a suffering nation, a nation embroiled in a real conflict, it was just part of the journey of the beginning of my career. And I'm saying all this to essentially tell you how it is that somebody who began her work studying the basic mechanisms of attention ended up studying mindfulness in military service members and first responders and other high-demand, high-stress professionals. But that's sort of the fast track of the journey. And what I want to share with you today, and I have a request, because you've been very kind. I have water that tastes like coffee. Could you get me some non-coffee water? Thank you, because 5 o'clock coffee does not sound fun to me. Thanks, Cliff. or Ron. Tables have turned. All right, so what I wanted to do is actually share with you, you know, what we've learned. And you could think of it almost like a case study of how we went from what I was learning in my own lab and all the work that I'd done to get to the point of having my own lab, and then how we have been able to bring it out into the world. So I couldn't be more thrilled to be a part of the kinds of talks that happened today, and really grateful to the team and Cliff for even having this kind of a conversation happen. So I will be bringing the lens of cognitive neuroscience, of attention and working memory, because those are sort of the workhorse systems that I study, in particular to look at mindfulness-based training programs. And so it's a narrow view. We've talked a lot about, especially if we think about the talk we just heard and the talk that I'm going to give now, they're sort of on almost different ends of the spectrum of how broad and deep this topic can be. So I just wanted to place where we're going to be for my presentation. And I, similar to Uri, did want to begin by my gratitude slide, because there are many, many people that allow me to say what I'm going to share with you today. The first thing is to say attention and working memory are extremely important brain systems. You didn't need to have me up here saying that to you. You all know that. And what we know about these systems is, the way I think about it is that essentially, oh, thank you, dear advisor. Appreciate it. Oh, thank you, thank you. The way I think about attention and working memory is that they're like a type of fuel. And if we are fueled up, things go very well. Things that are consequential. I've listed some of those things here, right? Our ability to plan, communicate, learn, regulate our emotions, make decisions, and guide our actions, our behaviors. And if we're not fueled up, it may not go so well. And that these capacities, and really when we talk about attention, we're talking about the ability to prioritize some information over other information, or working memory is sort of the cousin of attention, in which we're maintaining and manipulating information over short periods of time. These systems work together to allow us to do these things in the context of multiple domains, in the context of our ability to think clearly and make decisions, or our ability to experience emotion and regulate it, right? Or our ability to connect with other people and be in relationship with other people. And that's one of the benefits of being one of the last talks of the day, is that you've surveyed all of that in what we've been talking about. We've really gone through so many different beautiful examples of not just the value of these, the inheritances we have, but how contemplative practice may inform our ability to do those with greater ease and with less friction as we maneuver through the world. So I think that the main point I want to say here is that it matters that we're able to pay attention and remember and use information over short periods of time. So that brings us to really my revisiting of the title of this presentation, right? Out of the lab and into the world. So why would you want to go out of the lab? What's the motivating factors? And okay, I want to get out of the lab. I want to go into the world. How am I going to do this? And these are real questions that I actually had when I had that kind of almost, like I said, impatience and activism sense of, I want to do something, and I want to do something that is rigorous and grounded in science and can actually be helpful to people that have consequential jobs, whether it's in our society or as we have our footprint as a nation across the world. So let's begin with the why, and this is going to kind of scaffold our journey. The why in many cases is really started out for me, as I was describing earlier, with the studies that we're actually doing in the laboratory, very careful manipulations that we could do. And I'm going to give you a sample of a couple of those. But the question in these laboratory-based settings was, what compromises attention and working memory? What can we do to perturb the system that tells us about the basic mechanisms of how attention and working memory work? But at the same time, I was realizing that it's also giving us insight into the conditions that in our everyday lives may make attention and working memory become compromised, which compromises our functioning in the world. And so what I wanted to do is kind of simulate some of the ways in which challenge may occur. And one example, and this is kind of giving you a sense of the paradigms that we would use, was a delayed recognition task. This is a working memory task. And what you do in this task is simply you'll be presented with a face or two faces, and you are to, for the short period of time they're on the screen, encode that information, and then they'll disappear. And then a few seconds later, you'll see a single face, and you'll be asked to determine if that face was one of the two that you were asked to remember, right? This is how we hold information in mind. And a lot of the questions we were initially asking was, what are the mechanisms by which we maintain information? What does face processing have to do with all these? And this was very interesting stuff to me. But what I wanted to see is what would happen if you perturbed our ability to do the simple thing of holding faces in mind by presenting stimuli that might be distracting. And in this case, I call them negative and neutral stimuli, but you might have, especially after hearing Brandon's talk, just an entire set of descriptors for this. But one set of stimuli we thought would not be disruptive, and another set we thought would be. They're either negative or threatening, or some combination of those. And the question was really, what happens to working memory if in this innocuous, non-affective context, where all I'm doing is remembering the identity of faces, I present this task-irrelevant stimulus that you don't have to do anything with. It's just you're exposed to it. And by the way, the kinds of images we used are things that you get exposed to all the time if you're just scrolling through your phone. What happens to working memory? And what we found out is that, yes, indeed, working memory is perturbed. Our performance is worse when we have negative distractors than we have neutral distractors. And again, this is part of a snapshot of an entire field of research that's looking at the variety of distractors that may perturb working memory. So seeing this, that you can make accuracy worse, you can make response time slower, by me as the experimenter presenting something that is negative or threatening, I got very curious about what would happen if I wasn't the one imposing the distraction, but I just leaned on what the participants may happily do on their own, which is distract themselves, right? And so that might be happening for you right now. 5 o'clock on a Friday, as I said, you may be happily distracting yourself. But when we do this, there are going to be consequences for what happens in your information processing. And that was the question that we asked. So I said, let's try to keep the task as similar to what we know when we impose the distraction, and then let's just ask the question of how present people were to what they just experienced. And we did this by having another working memory task, and this time we manipulated how much information that they were asked to remember, one face or two faces, and then there was nothing going on in the delay interval, and then a single test face. But after certain trials, we'd ask the question, how on task were you in that last trial? Right? So we'd have their behavioral performance of how they just did, but then they're giving us insight into essentially their state of mind, their presence, their attention to the task in the moment just after. And we gave them a scale that they could respond. They were really on task, or they were off task, or wherever they felt they were in between. And what we found in that early study, this wasn't actually the point of the study, but I was very curious to look at it, is that, as you can kind of guess, the more off-task people are, the worse they perform. So if you're happily now having a fantasy about where you're going to have dinner or what you're going to do this weekend, and I gave you a quiz on what I just said, I don't think you're going to do that well, right? Because you're not actually hearing what I'm saying. Same idea. Performance is worse when you're off task versus on task. And we've gone on to study this across a number of different kinds of paradigms. Another one that we use very commonly in the lab is a sustained attention task. So this is, again, a pretty boring task in which what you're asked to do is just press a button every time you see a digit on the screen. But every now and then, the digit will be the number 3. And when you see the number 3, withhold. And we make those 3s happen infrequently. So you're sitting there, press, 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 3 appears, you press, and then it's usually like some kind of expletive, like, oh, shit, I should have done that. So you acknowledge it, and that usually gives you some insight into where your mind was right before that 3 appeared, because you saw it, but you were not checked in to what was going on. So again, asking them every now and then, where was your attention? And seeing what happens to performance as a function of how they respond. We've also looked at brainwave responses in response to these kind of parameters, and we see that the actual perceptual input is reduced when there are periods of time where people say they're off task. So early sensory processing looks like it's compromised. When you say you didn't see it or hear it because your mind was somewhere else, that really seems to be the case. And what we saw was very similar to the last result I showed you. This is now over 500 people that did this study, worse performance with your being more off task and more variable responses. So even your ability to systematically and consistently press a button is compromised when you're off task. So in some sense, this is just to kind of motivate why we would care. If something as simple as external distraction, things we get bombarded by all the time, that happens to be negative or threatening, can compromise attention, or our own internal distractibility, well, that's not so great, especially if attention really is this fuel to allow us to think clearly, to regulate our emotions, and to connect with others. And in the kinds of professions that I was interested in kind of pursuing, lapses in attention could be deadly, whether they are now medical health providers or firefighters or military service members. And we talk about reducing suffering in the world, but a lot of the professions that I was kind of on the horizon for me to want to work with were the ones that run in when there is active suffering happening by other people. And under those conditions, absolutely, you cannot be somewhere else. You have to deal with the task at hand. So the why, in some sense of why we want to bring contemplative practices out of the lab, is because they really have to do with the challenge point of attention, which is this critical brain system, and that we can become compromised under certain circumstances. So really, the next question is, that's great. It's actually terrible, because I can do this very easily in the laboratory setting, contrive situations that compromise these core brain systems. But what about in real-world settings? So even before I had the idea to go and work with service members and, for example, and other groups to provide mindfulness training, I was just curious to see what happened when I didn't have to contrive the situation, but I could hear from particular groups when they would say they're going to experience a high-stress interval. And it was known. So it could be as simple as undergrads, right? If you ask undergrads at the beginning of the semester or the end of the semester of how stressed do you think you are right now, it's going to just be an increasing line of more and more stress as you get to the point where now you're nearing final exam season, and then you got to take final exams, right? So there would be an example. Or if you ask other groups, people can identify, especially in many professions, the cyclical stress cycles they experience. And that, to me, was an opportunity to say, that's when I want to partner with you. I want to partner with you when we can identify what the beginning of a high-stress interval would be, and then a few to several weeks later, where you could say, at least it's abated, or it could continue to go, but I'm going to have discrete moments in time where I might be able to ask the question of what certain scenarios do in the real world that have these features of potentially having distracting information, threatening information experience, negative stimuli that might be experienced over protracted periods of time. So what happens in the real world? And this is just an example of the kinds of populations that we work with. In those initial studies where I was just trying to figure out what are the high demand intervals, and the one I'm going to talk about most today is in military service members, where we are looking at, and this was a wake-up call that they were not, the Army leaders that I was working with at that time were not so happy to hear. If you go through and have pre-deployment training so that you're getting ready to be deployed, it itself is a stressful period of time on purpose. Sometimes it's even called stress inoculation training to ready themselves for the combat context. But what was so not welcome was that, yeah, they might get familiar with this stressful context, but it's stressful. And so now you're preparing them to go, and then they're going to go. And if you start tracking what's going on in that interval, you may be disadvantaging the service members prior to them actually entering an actual combat zone, not a simulated one. And that's the kind of result we saw over and over again. If we took these discrete windows of time where we could probe with our objective laboratory measures and subjective reports of how people felt in their mood and their stress levels, and then a few to several weeks later do the same sort of thing, what we saw is that there is a significant decline in objective attentional and working memory performance, right? And if we took some of those same groups of people and then tested them when the circumstances were not a protracted period of high stress, we saw something that looked more like that dotted line. It was kind of up and down, but really it was pretty stable over time, like undergrads that are tested over the summer instead of an academic semester. All right, so in some sense, the question that was my first opportunity to get out of the lab and ask in real world settings, because I didn't create these high stress intervals, they were just being experienced by people. The answer was yes. Do we get the same kind of compromise as we could in these contrived laboratory settings in real world situations? So then the next question was, okay, now what do we do about it? If we know that attention is compromised, and these are consequential groups that we all lean on as a society, you know, your physicians and nurses, the healthcare system, we know this through the pandemic. They were not less burdened by a high demand, high stress, uncertain interval like all of us were. They were more burdened. And they can't mess up because then all of our lives are going to be in jeopardy. What can we do about it was the puzzle, and we tried a lot of different things. Initially, we tried things like light and sound devices, where maybe if we like flash things to people, and this was just to try to help in this kind of more controlled laboratory context to reduce the costs on attention in these demanding circumstances. Or we'd have them do brain training games to see if that would help. Or there would be other kinds of, you know, kind of mind-body interventions, you might say, like paying attention to your nutrition and your exercise. None of those were significantly able to protect against the decline that we were seeing in attention. In fact, some of them, as I'll talk about, made things worse because now we were adding the demand, in the nature of the demand, on people during these particular intervals. So the question, for a variety of reasons, I came to contemplative practice and in particular mindfulness training as one solution, and it made a lot of sense to me why this may be a solution that we want to pursue. Part of the answer was, again, part of my personal journey with this is that I was a stress case. And I felt like mindfulness was really helpful to me. So I'm like, well, I'm a case study of one, but you know, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's experienced high stress, like all of these other professionals that I'm interested in supporting. Let's check it out and let's put it to the most rigorous test that we can and explore it. Thankfully, there was also a growing understanding of what mindfulness training might actually be doing, right? And really, even if I looked at the description of what mindfulness is, now this is my own sort of restatement, but if mindfulness is really an antidote to having a wandering mind that may promote internal distraction that leads to a lot of the stress-related compromise that we were seeing, then maybe if we trained for it, then we could reduce the degree of rumination that might be driving up a stress-related compromise. And so this notion of mindfulness as a mental mode, a way of making the mind that we're all capable of, we don't need to get any special training to achieve it, but it's a way of making the mind that allows us to have attention as central, present-centered attention, and a way of orienting to our present moment experience without elaborating on what's occurring or without reacting to it. So if this is just a mode and we train for that mode, maybe we would actually see beneficial effects for attention. And you know, more recently now, people have done many, many studies on this to see what happens when people are in a formal contemplative training program, in particular mindfulness training. And one very common form of training is mindfulness-based stress reduction, which I saw John's face briefly splash on the screen. Jon Kabat-Zinn developed this program, you know, almost 3 decades ago, and it has inspired a whole world. 4 decades ago, sorry, I'm dating myself. It was 3 decades ago because that's when I learned about it, Cliff. Come on now. So because MBIs have been mindfulness-based interventions have really proliferated, we can now look at not a study or two that finds that it's beneficial, but we can look at meta-analyses, and we can look at meta-analyses of meta-analyses to put it to the test to see do mindfulness-based interventions actually have beneficial effects for attention. And I'm just showing you a snapshot of some more recent ones that suggest, yes, some suggest that attention is benefited, others suggest working memory is benefited. So I think we're still in an active situation of trying to figure out what exactly is happening. And of course, it matters what kind of intervention you're talking about. But the signs were all good that this is worth exploring, especially because most of these studies were not done in high stress, high demand cohorts under high stress intervals. But if in steady state or in a laboratory supported research study you see beneficial effects, maybe it's worth it. How much time do I have, Cliff?
So you've got nominally 10, which will be flexible to 15.
I'll just press 1.5 on my speaking speed. I'm just kidding. I wouldn't do that to you. I could do that, but I won't. All right, so this is basically getting you to the point of placing you where I was, this is worth exploring. Check it out and see if you can offer this to high-stress, high-demand groups that you were already finding were compromised over these demanding intervals. Then we come to the next question, which was really, all right, what do I do? How do I do this? How do I take this wonderful manualized program that has been well studied and known well in terms of its beneficial effects across a variety of domains? I was queuing in on attention and working memory because that was my home base. Those were the topics I was interested in. Thankfully, I didn't have to make up how people might go about introducing behavioral interventions. I was able to lean on the wisdom of the National Institutes of Health and their whole notion of a stage model of intervention development. And essentially, this approach allows us to go from a laboratory context into a real-world context, and with the final goal, in my view, the kind of end goal, which is, of course, going to be an iterative thing, to figure out if there's some way I could offer a program that would be acceptable and appropriate for the kinds of groups that I wanted to work with. And just to give you a quick rundown of these stages, it starts with a problem space, which we've already established. Yeah, attention and working memory can become compromised, stage 0. Then you come up with an intervention. Thankfully, I didn't have to build it from scratch because I could lean on the world of mindfulness-based interventions, and in particular, mindfulness-based stress reduction as a gold standard intervention that was being well studied. But I could then work in stage 2 to have a controlled kind of context in which I, as the researcher, was going to be partnering with somebody who's going to deliver the intervention after we created one that would be appropriate, and have a lot of control of the circumstances. Then we move it out to other people that aren't my research team and me, creating the intervention as stage 3, and then we can move on, if we're successful in all of this, to out in the wild. Now we go from efficacy studies to effectiveness studies, and then full-on implementation. All right, so it really is the journey of going from controlled laboratory context out into the real world, and having steps along the way that you'd kind of recycle through, because after you came up with a new intervention, you want to test that one out again, and so on. So you'll see some of that in this journey. And as I said before, stage 0 was pretty well established that, yeah, it is the case that attention can become compromised with multiple things, but including external and internal sources of distraction. So if it is the case that doing nothing at all leads people in these high stress intervals to become compromised, perhaps if we offered a type of training program involving mindfulness, we could keep things stable and steady. Right? And that was, to me, very, very important to establish that because frankly, if I tried to approach a funder and said, I want to do a study in which I'm going to give people this intervention. Yeah, it's the most stressful time in their life, but I'm going to give them this intervention, and guess what's going to happen? Nothing. It'll be exactly the same measures if I measure it twice. Nobody's going to jump up and down to try to give me funding for that. But if I explain that the reason that I want to look for stability is because the baseline is not stable, it is compromise. So establishing that there was a compromised condition that many groups were suffering from was going to be essential. And then we were just looking for stability, and if we were very lucky, if people engaged in these programs and then even practiced more than the minimum amount that we were asking them to, we might even be able to get above steady state and see improvements over high stress intervals. You guys tracking? All right. So then, now I have an approach. I have this NIH stage model that I can follow. But I will tell you that when all this was happening, I knew 0 people that were in the military. 0. I didn't have any friends. I didn't know anyone that was in the military. Nor did I know any firefighters. Nor did I know any football players. These are all the kind of groups that we ended up working with. So I did what I thought made sense, which is, well, if you want to work with a group, again, that you acknowledge that as a researcher, I don't know what the specific framing is that would make sense, the cultural norms that would make sense, the things that are most relevant to this community that aren't me, even though I as a researcher see where it could be beneficial, I need to collaborate with different communities. And again, this is where the leadership of the NIH can be very helpful. Community-based participatory research is a thing, and we have been talking about it essentially all day long, that there's a formal way in which you can partner with the groups that you want to work with. And this is now essentially almost thinking about this from a non-dual perspective. It's not me and other, but we're in this together because we have a shared goal of achieving something that could provide benefits to the groups that we want to collaborate with. So the goal, in some sense, is to enhance a community's ability to address important health issues. And those are important health issues that in the collaboration are deemed mutually of interest so that we can work together by developing effective interventions that can be maintained over time. So it's not a one and done. It's not coming in, I'm going to save your community as this outsider, or you're going to be the site, or you're going to be the target audience. It is collaborating together. And that means really doing all of these things that truly requires. Understanding the context, right? Understanding the context from the point of view of the needs that the community is experiencing, the challenges, the barriers, the sensitivities, the demands. And I knew from the start that I didn't need to have all of that as something I already possessed, but this could be part of the collaborative process. And that these aspects, understanding the context, would inform the framing of what we offered. Now, I knew that I wanted to be mindfulness-based interventions because prior work had suggested this was a good way to go, but there's a lot of different ways that framing can happen, and I love, Sujatha just gave us beautiful examples of that, of the multiple contexts in which these pieces of wisdom, the wisdom traditions of the world, can be brought into benefit those that are open to having that kind of access. So how is the framing going to best meet the needs of the community? So, as we'll talk about, if it's not stress and symptom reduction, if people don't view themselves as being stressed, because frankly, that's the response I would often get. I'm not stressed. I run into burning buildings. Yeah, I'm not stressed. So I couldn't use that kind of framing, but having conversations with these individuals got me interested in and really trying to explore what is the framing that would allow them to see that there's a way in for them to find it interesting and be relevant and be beneficial. So appropriate framing, and then also the research design. As a researcher, this was something that I thought I had an idea of how to do science right? Use the gold standard approach. It's going to be a randomized controlled trial. And yeah, I want to have every individual get assigned to the condition that my log sheet says that they should be involved in. Well, that does not always work because that is not the context in which people are going to be able to participate. So the first thing we learned, for example, in working with military colleagues is you cannot schedule individuals when you're talking about small teams that are having coordinated schedules all together. So we were never going to be able to do, in most of our work with infantry, individual randomization. We'd probably have to do group randomization, and that was going to have to be okay. Or even though I wanted to have a control group that was not going to get anything, because I wanted to see if there was degradation, the leaders said, no, if you're going to give something to any of my soldiers, you've got to give it to all of my soldiers because I don't want anybody disadvantaged, which I truly appreciated. And so that also informed us trying to move toward crossover designs instead of just doing an RCT and then leaving it at that, in which there'd be a no training or even a wait list group that might get some truncated portion of it. So it informed so many different aspects, as well as, of course, the delivery. Who should be the one that actually provides the training? Some outside person that's flown in to be the expert that delivers this training to a group that they don't really know anything about? Or should we actually grow from within the community of people that are going to be recipients of it, the opportunity to deliver it to their colleagues? And I just want to kind of say that this really means we need all of these things. We need community collaborators. We need internal champions, because even if you get the ball rolling, there has to be some momentum, especially in organizations where there's organizational leadership turnover. If there's not some continuity of interest that's generated from within, there's not going to be a lot of ability to conduct anything. Leadership support, and then of course the way you're going to message and recruit. And truly it relies on the things that I've got in that white box. It has to be a mutual trust, respect, flexibility on both parts, the researcher and the collaborating organization and individuals. And then continuity of relationship. And I will tell you that it was a surprise to me that I've gone from knowing no military service members or first responders to having these people be some of my closest and dear friend colleague, like Deepu was saying. The new term we're going to invent, right? Fraulegs? Fraulegs is good. And I just want to kind of touch on that, because a lot of times I'll talk about this work and you don't get to see what that really feels like and what it takes to actually have a true collaboration. It means briefing leaders, going into organizations, and really getting to know people so that we have a true collaborative, participatory opportunity. And then figuring out ways to incorporate it in. So this bottom photograph is the University of Miami football team. We would go in at the end of their weight training and give them iPod shuffles. You remember those? And we'd ask them to do their mindfulness practice as part of their mindful post-conditioning cool down. So we have to take our opportunities of when are they going to be available and open to doing this, and we've got to fit it in. And the same thing with our service member colleagues, from how we're going to recruit to who's going to be our trainers or where we're going to find time. Yeah, we're at the, there's one picture up here, yeah. Yeah, sure, there's trash cans over here, but we can sit right now and we can practice. And they would take the opportunity and a trainer would train them. As well as, turning broom closets into ERP brainwave recording labs. Like, you just try to make it work. And thankfully, we've been able to. And so in the last few minutes, I'm going to just give you a snapshot of what we've learned through this work that I would say are starting to allow us to understand what best practices look like across a variety of groups that I would probably lump together as high demand groups, high demand, high stress groups that we are collaborating with over a high demand, high stress interval. And the considerations that we wanted to be thinking about is, there are certain things about this group, these people, especially the military service members, and I'm curious, is anybody in the room a former, current service member or has family members or friends? Okay, good. So some hands went up. So, and I appreciate the note about who of us are, right? People in the room. We're not talking about others. This is all of us, and we certainly can be touched by communities in a very specific way. Time pressured. We're dealing with them at the most intense time to offer the research project. We wanted to know if we're going to offer them something, how is it different than the other things that are available to them? Does it actually make a difference in terms of what we might be providing through a mindfulness training program versus something else? And that something else that we were interested in picking are things that the different communities that we're working with already do. So it was football players, it was relaxation training because performance psychologists were already offering it to them. For the military, it was positivity training because the DoD was already offering positive psychological interventions. So that was another opportunity to say, if it's beneficial, more beneficial than what? And then, of course, scalability. Who are going to be the people that will be offering the training in the most beneficial way? So the first challenge point, if we had our starting point as this gold standard, wonderful program, mindfulness-based stress reduction, and we wanted to model training off of that paradigm of 8 weeks and 24 hours and 45 minutes a day of practice. When I said this to some of our initial colleagues, it was a non-starter. It's like, thank you, but no thank you. There's no way that we're integrating that into our program, and we're not going to be able to do it. So what that led us to, and I appreciate Deepu's point of an entire decade of your life's work on one slide, which is what I'm showing you here. We ended up doing a systematic series of studies where we took essentially the same core program that we contextualized in collaboration with military service members, and then we reduced the time footprint of the program, because if time pressure was going to be the barrier, let's see if we can address it. And what we found is that you can get lower than 24 hours and preserve the key target variables that I was interested in, attention and working memory, but you can't go too low because then all of a sudden it's not really worth the time. So 8 hours and 4 weeks was about the time frame that tended to work, with about 12 to 15 minutes of daily practice that we were asking them to do. When it came to comparing it with other programs, we were actually able to compare it, like I said a moment ago, to positivity training. And remember, you'll see that this is a subtraction between time 2 and time 1. So there was degradation. That's why we're in the negative direction. There's degradation across the board. The magnitude of the degradation, though, was less in the group that received mindfulness training, MT, relative to positivity training, which was PT. So that was also very interesting, is that all interventions were not the same. Yeah, I'm almost done. He's giving me the what's it called, the hook. I'm pretty close. Only 25 more slides, guys. No, I'm kidding. In terms of the cultural container, again, in collaboration with senior leaders, we kind of rebuilt the program from the ground up. So we said, if these are the features, if this is the feature space, let's build something so that we can actually make it amenable to having people that don't know anything about mindfulness, but know a lot about the cultural context, deliver it. And then one of the first studies we did was we actually put head-to-head groups of people that knew nothing about mindfulness, went through a 10-week practicum and delivered it. These were context familiar trainers, performance psychologists that were Army performance psychologists, compared their delivery to soldiers receiving training from a mindfulness expert, MBSR certified 30-year trainer who knew nothing about the military context, to a no training group. And what we found was really it was when you knew about the context that it really seemed to support the reduction of degradation in these functions. And that sort of started giving us a sense of how to do this in a way that might generalize across a variety of high stress, high demand intervals. And we've now been able to go on to train a variety of groups and training trainers that are context collaborative with us and are context familiar to then offer the program to people within the community that they would like to support, that we all would like them to support. So this is our kind of journey through the stage model using the CBPR, community-based participatory research approach. And that lets me wrap up to say that we are getting a handle on the why for sure, but really more importantly for the effort that we've been at for the last 10 years, the how. And I hope that this can be sort of a somewhat inspiring model of how this is possible to do. Because I would really want to encourage more scientists, activists that have that spirit like I do to try to do something with everything that we're learning with our work. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. And I think it really is a beautiful example of how you truly can take this out of the lab and into the world to really be of benefit. So thank you so much for putting your expertise, deep expertise into that. We have time for a couple of quick questions. Yes? I thought if you leave the stage. No. Hook. Okay. No. So let's we see a hand over here. And then we'll try to make time for one for Zoom, and then we need to move.
Thank you very much for the
Where are you? Raise your hand. I can't. Oh, there you are. Okay. Hi.
Hi. Bart Wise. Thank you very much for the presentation and for doing the work on this. I'm actually a physician at the UC Davis Medical Center and also on the Wellness Committee for the Medical Center. But a couple of questions. For physicians, of course, there's been sort of steadily increasing stress over many years, and it's been amplified by the pandemic over the last few years. And the work that you're describing is sort of predicated on high demand intervals, but here we have a situation where people are in high demand situation for very, very extended periods of time where it starts to not become intervals, but rather is the standard of experience. So I'm sort of wondering if you could speak, number one, to how these kind of interventions might apply in situations that are a little bit different from the test situations that you were using. And then second of all, it's basically resulted in about 60% of physicians nationwide being, meeting the criteria for burnout. Yeah. And they're largely conscious of this, basically. And I'm interested in the community-based element of the research too, because I think that when we talk about things like mindfulness training to the community, some of these communities anyway, the medical community, it's sort of perceived as potentially a Band-Aid that is substituting for actual systemic change that would reduce stress in a long-term process. So I'm wondering how one would get buy-in and whether it actually may be, non-beneficial to actually produce things that may be viewed by administrations and other things as substituting for real systemic change.
Yeah, really good questions. And I would say this is what was the comment this morning? A but and? It's a both are true. Yes and, right. So the first part of your question regarding burnout and the situation for healthcare providers, no question, right? There's a study that just came out that not only tracked that burnout corresponds to attention decline, it's one of the first vulnerabilities that can happen in terms of cognitive functioning, but that there are consequential medical errors tied to that burnout and executive control challenge. So absolutely, it's a very real phenomenon that has unfortunately been protracted for much of the last 3 to 4 years. And in terms of the way to track it, so it is a different context, and we are being asked often to work with medical systems, healthcare systems, to see what we can do. Essentially, from the research side, it would be, because it is a kind of already a depleted state and a protracted depleted state. So it's almost like you're at some point things started going south, and then they just are potentially even further diminished or maintaining their level. What we look for is a regaining of cognitive functioning when people receive mindfulness training. That would be the signal, and we have seen some evidence of that when you offer training to folks, they now all of a sudden working memory and attention start looking sort of up to normative levels that you'd expect to see. In terms of the Band-Aid issue, this is a larger question regarding the place of mindfulness training. Is it just a way to not have any real responsibility of an organization to result in system change, or is it actually doing something? And it can be actually doing something and still be a check-the-box event for administration and not cause system change. This is where I'd like to, and I just talked to a group of nurses about this. If we want change within any system, and we are the ones that are experiencing the negative effects of the way the system is, the unfortunate burden and reality becomes we've got to be the ones that are going to demand the change. And that is very hard to do in a depleted state. If you do not have the capacity to know how you should be treated that is humane, how are you ever going to demand it, right? So in some sense, I see the benefits of mindfulness training as empowering those that can then really put pressure on the administration to not require the kind of shift work and long hours that are part of what a lot of healthcare systems are now requiring. So I don't see this, even though the intention may not be there, the result may be to promote system change, as long as that is part of the messaging that even comes across in the delivery of the mindfulness training. And when people from within a community are doing it, and they're the ones that are delivering the training, those conversations come up organically.
Thank you. We'll take one question from Zoom, and then we'll have to be done with questions for this session. So go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Jha, and for those previous and for the presentation to come. I do want to recognize the diversity in contemplative practices. My understanding would be that MBSR training might specifically enrich focal attention, which would be necessary in the execution of certain tasks within high demand settings. However, I'm curious if in your future direction, there is inclusion, or in previous research studies, the inclusion of other contemplative practices. I could imagine, for instance, open monitoring type of meditation or loving kindness meditation might improve other attentional functions that might be beneficial to such populations. So I'm wondering if there's some sort of direction there in your lab.
Jared, is that you?
Yes, that's me.
I knew I recognized him. We've actually never met, but we've had one other Zoom interaction. A great question. It was not a plant, so thank you for asking that. And it gave me an opportunity to actually say something that I didn't get to say, which is that along the lines of what you're saying, now whether MBSR really has an effect on focal attention is a debate. So I would say no. I would not say it's probably exclusive to that's the only kind of brain attention system that's being impacted. But it allows me the opportunity to say that at least this MBAT program that we've kind of developed through our all the other work that we were doing has 4 different practices in it. So focused attention, which is sort of the through line, which is breath awareness practices along the lines of some of the things that we did together, body scan, open monitoring, and loving kindness. And loving kindness practice we'll usually refer to as a connection practice, where a lot of the anchoring is around the community that you're with, your fellow teammates, people that you support in the work that you do, and then expanding that outward. So it is the case that we are incorporating sort of a cross-training of contemplative practices within this short four-week program. All right.
Thank you so much. Now I'd like to invite up Dr. Nava Levit-Benoon to share with us about the work that her research group has been doing around bringing mindfulness and meditation practices into conflict situations for peace building and conflict transformation. So really excited to hear this. And again, thank you for sticking with us. And sorry for not having time for all the questions. We want to make sure that Dr. Levy Benoon also gets her full time. So thank you so much.
Okay, so good evening, and thank you for sticking by. It's been a long day. I have to say that I was looking forward for this day. I knew it's going to be interesting, but I was surprised by how it was much more interesting even than I thought. I learned so much, so thank you for all the other presentations. And yeah. Okay. So my name is Nava Levit Benoon. I'm a neuroscientist from Reichman University in Israel. It's the first and only private university in Israel. And I want to tell you today about some of the dissemination work that my center is doing. I had the center of the Segal Center for Brain and Mind in the psychology department, which was founded by Professor Mario Mikulincer, which is working here with Phil Shaver, and a well-renowned scientist that works with, heads the field of attachment theory. And a lot of the things that I've, my possibility to do many of the things that I've done was a lot because Mario was very supportive. And when I told him, yeah, there's this mind and life thing, and he's like, yeah, I've been there with Phil. I met some people. So, yeah, so that's where I sit, somewhere. The lab is over there. And actually, I'll go back to the slide in a second. I want to say something about the place that I'm coming from. So I remember going to the Mind and Life meetings many years ago and feeling different from the other participants, feeling that I have some sense of urgency that I feel that other people are not feeling. I think it changed. We are all now feeling a sense of urgency. Israel is a place with a lot of challenges. There's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, there's occupation, and there's a lot of internal challenges and conflicts within the Israeli society. And if you're following the news, just before I came to the US, we were all busy in demonstrations, and that's what's on our mind right now. Israel is a very diverse society. There's really so many groups. There's Arabs. The Arabs are divided into groups. There's Muslims, there's Christians, there's Bedouins, there's Druze. There's the Jewish society is very diverse also. So like I said, I'm a neuroscientist. I do basic science. I won't talk about it so much today, maybe just one slide. And we're really interested in the last years in understanding the mechanisms underlying contemplative practices. We also do cultural adaptation study that I'll tell you a little bit about. In 2009, my husband and I were just a moment before signing our contract to a new apartment that we were planning to buy in Tel Aviv, and looked at each other and we're like, are we crazy to buy an apartment and invest all our money in this place that has so many beautiful things about it, but it's actually, when you think logically and you look at the conflict and all the complexity, it looks like it doesn't really have a chance. And we did the irrational thing of deciding to buy the apartment and staying. We were born in Israel, we love Israel, our families are there. But that was when I decided that if I'm staying in Israel, then for my kids, we have to do something about it. And my analysis was that much of the suffering that's happening, which is layers and layers of an history of suffering, the only way to go forward, I'm not saying solve all the problems, but really go forward is by having people become more aware of the emotions, thoughts, beliefs, biases that they come with to these conflicts. And that's when I decided to found the Muda Institute, Muda in Hebrew is to be aware. It was in 2009. Maro Mikolinzer gave me his support. The support was 10,000 shekels, which is about $2,000 a year, to invite people. So Richie Davidson was my first keynote speaker in 2009. Since then, we have been doing a lot of activity in Israel, mainly in two areas. One is education. You know, if you want to change something, you have to always go through education. We have a very big, very serious education program. It's called the Sagol Purple School Program. I'm not going to talk about it right now, but if you're interested, I'll be happy to tell you about it. I gave a talk about it in MIT a month ago, and I can send you the recording. I'm really proud of the work we're doing there. And the other thing is cultivating what I call change agents, so people that can actually bring mindfulness into the society. We brought MBSR and MBCT to Israel. We got the permission to start training MBSR and MBCT facilitators, and pretty fast we also understood that we have to create additional structures in which people that will not ever go through Buddhist centers, but we do want them to have enough training and practice so they could become mindfulness facilitators from different communities, could really do the whole track. So we also build a lot of other trainings that can enable people to become mindfulness experts. And you can get a glimpse a little bit of the many, many people that are involved and much activity. Psychoeducation, podcasts, lectures, development of trainings, mind and lifestyle meetings, etc., etc. John Kabat-Zinn was there, came to Israel, Richie, a lot of other people supported us. There's this quote that's attributed to the Buddha that says, conflict is the greatest challenge because in conflict, the self is contracted with the speed of lighting into me and mine. And I really think that trying to understand how to deal with conflict is a very, very big challenge. I want to dedicate this talk to a friend of mine, Tali Gazai. She passed away in September. She was she came to our MBSR project that we did in order to understand how mindfulness can support Ethiopian Jews, and she really got in love with mindfulness, and then she did all the other things, and she started training as a mindfulness facilitator for kids. And we had a lot of dreams together too. She was like a really champion in the Ethiopian community. Unfortunately, we lost her, and I think, very sad. So I want to dedicate this talk to her. And the talk plan would be to first of all ask, can mindfulness practice create conditions for conciliatory mindsets? Can contemplative practices create conditions for cross-partisan communication? And how should standard mindfulness protocols be adapted to serve the needs of people from various communities? I didn't change it there. I changed it in the other slide. I forgot it's also here. So thank you for the talk that helped me notice this. So from various communities. And I want to, okay. And I'm also going to mention a term that I'm starting to use, and I find it helping us think about what we're doing, mindfulness as relief versus mindfulness as engagement. So can mindfulness create conditions for conciliatory mindsets? So inspired by my colleagues in our department from social psychology, negative intergroup perceptions and emotions are known to play a crucial role in fueling intergroup conflict, anger, and hatred toward the outgroup. And this is linked to attribution of blame and increased political intolerance to the outgroup. Perceived threat from the outgroup is associated with support for exclusionary practices against minority groups and support for aggressive retaliatory policies. And on the other hand, there's much research that shows that transformation of emotions and perceptions are key elements in developing reconciliations in conflict. And already, we can start understanding why mindfulness. But I want to bring in this concept that I'm borrowing from a paper that I find on Mind Archive, where the only person I know here is Norman Farb, but very interesting paper that talked about mindfulness as relief versus mindfulness as engagement. And when you go back to the classical views of mindfulness, you see that really mindfulness is much, much more than stress reduction, right? Mindfulness is a skillful and active process of engaging attention and emotion regulation with challenging experiences that guide behavior to reflect one's value, affording opportunities to reason, discern, and select among available responses that might involve taking or inhibiting action depending on the demands of the situation. Yeah, it enables exploring and eventually reappraising challenging experiences as a source of meaning, which enables the capacity to adaptively engage with the situation. So it's about engagement. The relief, is in order for us to be able to take a moment and then understand what is the right thing to do, what is the best way to engage with the challenges of life. And it's very interesting that when you go back to the roots of where mindfulness came from, the roots of Buddhism, there's really, you see that even in the way the Buddha explained how do you, for example, deal with hatred. So he says there are 5 ways of subduing hatred. And what are they? When one gives birth to hatred for an individual, one should develop goodwill. And the other is one should develop compassion. And the third sentence is one should develop equanimity towards that individual. And look at the fourth one. When one gives birth to hatred for an individual, one should pay him no mind and pay him no attention. So even looking away or being disengaging with the situation is one of the possibilities, if that's the adaptive thing to do. Etc. Okay, so this understanding that mindfulness practice enables a greater engagement with difficult situation, as well as moving flexibly between engagement and disengagement in an adaptive, embodied manner. This is actually what we're doing in our basic science in our lab. And you see here 2 papers that came out where we actually show that people after mindfulness training are more able to select the more adaptive regulatory strategy to deal with a challenging situation because, and this is very relevant for serious conflictual situations, it's not always the most adaptive thing is to engage with the situation. Sometimes the more adaptive thing is to take a step back, disengage, regulate yourself, and come back when you have the resources. And we found that mindfulness 8-week MBSR practice actually affects the tuning between the body and the brain, what we call interoception, which then helps predict how people will deal with situations. So people do tend to engage more after MBSR, but they are tuned to their body, and when the arousal is very high, they disengage, which is actually the more adaptive thing to do. Why mindfulness is because mindfulness is not just a regulatory strategy, it's we propose that it's the ability to choose the best regulatory strategy and the best way to engage, the more adaptive, the best adaptive way to engage with situation, which is super important when we talk about long intractable conflicts. The first study I want to tell you about, where we were asking the question, and it somehow relates to some questions that were here along the day. Can mindfulness affect perceptions and emotions related to an intractable conflict like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and all that goes with it, the occupation, etc. And here we had, so this is a study that Alon Alkobi did today. He's heading our R&D in the education program. And here we brought 101 Jewish Israeli, most of them were students, that were either did an MBSR course or were in a waitlist control. So all were matched to the motivation to one, reduce their stress, and second, to do it with mindfulness. It was a regular MBSR. We recruited them, or we asked them to come for, they actually even paid for some of it. It just was a reduced price, but the MBSR course was described as something to reduce your own stress in your life, in the semester. We took demographics and questionnaires, also camouflaged it so it wouldn't be so obvious what is our aim. And then after the MBSR, both MBSR and waitlist control participants came to the lab. They were randomized to either also have a 10-minute cognitive reappraisal training, which was found to have some effects, or not to have. So that was also enabled us like active control. Then they saw a movie that was really anger-inducing related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, something that really angers Jewish participants. And they were given self-reports about negative emotions, perceived threat, and willingness to compromise. Just to say that in terms of political ideology, this was in 2016. I don't think, I don't know what it would have been if it's today, but that was more or less the distribution of political ideology in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So as you can see, how do I, with the map? Okay. Yeah, I think I got it. But then, okay. So just to go briefly, yeah, I think you can already see you have the, okay, I don't manage the mouse, but you can see that you have 2 bars for the waitlist, 2 bars for the mindfulness. The difference between the 2 bars is with or without additional 10-minute reappraisal training. And you can see that that there wasn't really a difference between whether mindfulness with reappraisal or with not reappraisal, but in all cases, the mindfulness was greater than the waitlist. And just so you'll have an impression, the ratings of negative emotions, so was hostility towards Palestinian Israelis, hate, anger, despair from the continuous conflict. The rating of perceived threat was around questions like Israeli Palestinians proved constantly that they are unreliable, they are always a threat to the security, primitive lifestyle endangers Israeli culture, living in Israel they are a persisting threat, and the support for compromise was around territorial compromise, symbolic compromise on the status of Jerusalem, and compromise on the status of Palestinian refugees. So there was a difference, but there was also a difference for the, you can also see that the waitlist plus reappraisal was also high in some cases. But when you go to and do a model, then it's really nice to see that while all the interventions, meaning MBSR, cognitive reappraisal, and both together affect negative emotions, which affect the perceived stress the perceived threat, and this is what mediates the support of compromise. Mindfulness also goes directly to the perception. So this is what we know. It's not only a regulatory strategy. That it regulates emotions, but also it can change the level of perception. So this is the first study I wanted to tell you about. Another study is the question, can contemplative practices create conditions for cross-partisan communication? We know today, and in Israel we know today even more, that facilitating cross-partisan communication is a critical goal toward protecting democracy and the well-being of societies. We define controversial issues as unresolved social questions that generate considerable disagreement, with different groups in society holding different interpretations and offering varying solutions to these questions. And creating opportunities for constructive engagement in controversial issues enables people to remain open to varying views, develop critical thinking skills, understand multiple sides of an argument, increase their awareness of social issues, and develop their opinions based on a large and diverse set of information. And this is why you would like to give these skills already to children, right? Because they are the citizens that will be dealing with these controversial issues. However, studies show that teachers avoid discussing controversial issues in their classroom. And in Israel, there's even a study that shows that Arab Israeli teachers even avoid more and report self-censorship. There's many reasons for that. Some of them are political, compared to Jewish Israeli teachers. So in Arab schools, this even happens less. This is, again, is from 2016. Unfortunately, political situation in Israel changed much in the last 10 years, and I'm not sure that these numbers are correct. I'm pretty sure that Jewish Israeli teachers don't also exercise self-censorship in the political situation today. And then the question is, can contemplative practice add something in addition to other interventions and create conditions for cross-partisan communication? So there's not studies that directly show it, but there's all kinds of evidence that's around it, like that mindfulness has been associated with better workplace and romantic interpersonal conflict, with reducing the tendency to retaliate in response to perceived workplace injustice or to provocation. Work by Paul here, right? That's one of your papers. Reduce prejudice towards minorities, reduce stereotypal thinking and racial discrimination towards one's outgroup, and better communication, but in romantic conflict. So what about cross-partisan communication or situations which are intergroup? So we got a grant from the Mind and Life. It's also a possibility to express gratitude for this support. And there was a study that was led by Shiri Godano-Bar, together with Michal Reifentagar, which is a social psychologist, and with the assistant of Noah Dolev. And before I tell you about the study, I just want to say that a nice thing about the study was that we were able to bring in the community stakeholders, meaning that we were able to train facilitators from Arab community that were part of this project, Muna and Nufuz, and empowered a young women students that came to my lab and from the Arab community. And it's not trivial because, as in many situations, many times Arab students don't easily come to become research assistants and develop themselves as researchers. So we did one good thing just even before we got the results. Shiri Godano-Bar developed with another colleague a protocol that's called Mind the Conflict. And the model is based on the idea that we want to bring mindfulness into a conflictual situation. That means being able to identify the triggers for the conflict, be aware of sensations, feeling, and thought, suspend reactions, identify needs. And when this happens, there's more readiness and resources to create a safe space for empathic listening, for self-expression, to share about needs, to express gratitude, resonating a little bit with the former talks, and then creating the next step, which is moving towards sustainable cooperation. And you can see here the both-and solution. And really integrating contemplative skills that helps core inquiries: what happens to me in conflict, what happens to the other in conflict, what happens in a situation, with core practices that many of us know, like awareness to the body, staying with difficulty, mindful listening, etc. So in this study, the study was supposed to be in Arab schools, Jewish schools, and then they were supposed to bring them together. Unfortunately, the COVID stalled the project, but we were able to do the project in the Arab schools. So there were teachers and students from 4 Arab schools in 3 towns in Israel, which are on the border of the occupied territories, 119 teachers, 1,256 8th and 9th graders from 39 classes. And the idea, the experiment went like this. Teachers in the experimental group got a 30-hour Mind the Conflict program. We had an active control group, which it's supposed to be 2.5 hours, not 25 hours. Sorry, I don't know what happened. But it's that treatment as usual. Actually, it's more than a treatment as usual. Teachers in Israel have a written protocol that tells them what to do in conflictual discussions. That's all. We took the protocol, we created a 2.5-hour workshop, and that was the active control. After each intervention, the teacher also initiated discussions in class. And we took data pre-post from teachers and students, and also while they were engaging with discussions in class. We managed before the COVID to get into something like 2 discussions in each class. And we have various tools, quantitative tools, all kinds of questionnaires related to motivation to engage in controversial discussions, sense of efficacy and competence, dimensions of mindful engagement, evaluation of others. We also had qualitative data. We still haven't analyzed it. And the main findings are that regarding teachers, first of all, it's nice to see that both types of training led to increase over time in teachers' sense of legitimacy to discuss controversial issues, the mere fact that they just did it. But the mind and conflict teachers demonstrated a significantly greater increase in a mindfulness and conflict index following the intervention. They reported a positive change in their willingness to engage their students in difficult controversial issues. They expressed lower levels of reluctance. It was expressed as lower levels of reluctance to hold such discussions. They assigned a much higher importance to dealing with controversial issues in the classroom compared to the pre-intervention levels and to the control group. They had more democratic conduct during the discussions, but there was no significant difference in change in self-efficacy. A little bit, but not significant. For the students, regardless of the group, the more students were exposed to difficult conversations, the more they participated in the discussion, and the more positive they perceived its quality and its general atmosphere, just letting them talk and being able to be in this situation. But in addition, the students of teachers that did the Mind the Conflict program exhibited a higher level of participation in the discussions and perceived the discussion to be of higher quality. There was no significant difference between conditions for the general atmosphere and behavior, no significant difference between the conditions for the, oh, excuse me, I did it again. The mind and conflict classes made a greater positive change in the willingness overall and in the sense of self-efficacy to engage in difficult conversations. However, no significant difference in the attribution of importance. Mind and conflict teachers reported a more significant increase in the positive behavior of the students during the conversations. And if we go to a few quotes, then quotes from teachers. One teacher said, "The tools influence the way students organize their thoughts and the way they express them. During the conversation, they listened to each other. Such listening did not exist before. There was a good atmosphere during the conversation and most students shared their opinions. I was positively surprised and this motivated me since I was worried they wouldn't share. In the end of a conversation, a student turned to another and expressed appreciation to her opinion despite it being contradicting his." While we were doing the study, we realized that there's a really lack of tools to assess the mindset of people in conflict and reconciliation, and this triggered Shiri to go into a Ph.D. Research program, which is together with Professor Ofra Meizes from Haifa University, and she's trying to really define a reconciliation mindset and ways to measure and measure its benefit and measurement tools. And we are collaborating with her now on this. If you are interested or you're in the field, I think Shiri would really be happy to know about your work also and collaborate. So you have the email there. Okay, so the last point was, how much time do I have?
10 minutes.
Okay, so I'm even gonna finish earlier, I hope, and let you guys rest. So, of course, it's nice that mindfulness, maybe, initial results can support reconciliation or reconciliation mindsets, but for that we need the different groups to be able to have these tools. And while in 2009, mindfulness was only in the Buddhist centers and a little bit in the New Age centers in Israel, one of the things that we were very happy to see that today, 2023, around the central areas of Israel, where most of the population is, mindfulness is all over the place. It's like yoga. I think it's a lot because of our work. I mean, that's what people tell us. But like it happened here, we were also woke up to the fact that actually it's all over the place, but in the part of Israel which is actually the more privileged part. People that have more resources, that have access, that have time to take care of themselves, to know that they have the understanding that they're stressed and they can do something about it. But there's other groups that actually don't have access to mindfulness, even don't know about mindfulness. And for example, we have Ethiopian Jews that came from Ethiopia, and they're a very small group in Israel, but they have many, many challenges. And you can see here students from our university in one of the celebration days of the community. But these students tell me a lot about their challenges when they're going out of the university and facing all kinds of, looking for job, and they're facing prejudice, and they're even facing racism. We have, of course, 20% of the population is Palestinian Israelis. That means Arab Israelis. Most of them define themselves as Palestinians. We have Bedouins in the south. And then we also have a very large ultra-Orthodox community with 13%. And within that, there's women in the ultra-Orthodox community, which is also a special group. So we started trying to understand and learn how can we bring mindfulness to the various communities, and these are the communities that we were able to approach until now. Just to give you some principles of our adaptation research, then first of all, we understood very fast that we should always prefer to have facilitators from the community, which is almost not existing, but through our structure that we created with a lot of reaching out and giving out scholarships, we were able to train MBSR and MBCT teachers from the Ethiopian Jewish community, from ultra-Orthodox, and from Arab. And also that the research leaders and research assistants, when it's possible, will come from the community, and really finding champions that are usually early adapters and also mental health professionals that can enable us to understand what we're doing and think about the adaptations. We usually come in with we do the generic MBSR or MBCT protocol with no specific adaptation, and then we go through a process of qualitative research interviews, trying to understand what worked, what didn't work, what needs to be adapted, and then go through another process of creating an adapted course with these mental health professionals from these communities, and continuing this process, when possible, to interview in the mother language, for example, Arabic, and when possible, also quantitative tools, and really come with a beginner's mind, very humble, a lot of sensitivity. Many of these communities are very sensitive for being researched. They don't like to be guinea pigs. Some central themes that came across groups, because I don't have time to, and I don't think that we have to go each group. We don't, I mean, it's not communities that live here, but interestingly, like we really know from the literature, also in Israel, groups that are minorities in Israel deal with multiple stressors, not only the ones that are the daily or the regular, but also ones that are related to internal community structures and as external social structures of injustice and prejudice and discrimination. But we see in all the groups that mindfulness has a lot of potential to support even these stressors. That there are in the different communities. So people say, oh, you know what? Now that I know what mindfulness is, actually we have that. We have these qualities in our cultures or in our religions, and it's really interesting to try to see how things can connect. In all the groups that we studied, there is difficulty with emotional language, with being vulnerable. Usually there's much less access to psychological treatments. It's also considered culturally not appropriate. So if you go to a psychologist because you're a little bit stressed, you need someone to talk to, then you have a problem. So people don't go to these groups. And all the work with emotions is a challenge, but also mindfulness can be a relief to work with difficult emotions and thoughts. Like many groups that are dealing with stress, with many stressors, we see the lack of resources, time, and space to cultivate mindfulness practices. Doing nothing, right? There's doing and being. This state of being, which is doing nothing, is very difficult across these groups. Because it's not considered legitimate just to sit and not to do anything. And we also see that when we ask them, what is the best conditions and set for you? Do you prefer a facilitator from the community? Do you prefer that all the group would be from the community, or do you want a heterogeneous? We find all the answers. And one of the things that I learned from that is that really people want to have the choice to define themselves, whether part of a community or not part of the community, and it's also something to listen to. You can see here both the students, but also that this is Muna and Fatme, the two our facilitators, and Sarah and Noga, that's the two MBCT facilitators that we trained, and they were part of the project. And just to give you in the few moments, and you tell me when the time finished, because I can, I'm just going to do that until give me a minute for the conclusion. Okay, great. Okay. So, for example, dealing with racism. So, one of the Israelis from Ethiopian origin says, my reaction to racism is different today. I make efforts. Let's say today I will come across the case of someone racist in the store that says to me, go back to Ethiopia. Today I will not be seduced into the conflict by him. I will not get into the emotional whirlpool that he is creating. An Arab participant. In mindfulness, you are more aware of yourself. There is less need for the feedback of others, that you are okay, do not care what others think. My strength motivates me. I'm not in need. I have more confidence, and it lifts from the energy and awareness not to be constantly a victim. Interesting quote from a ultra-Orthodox woman. She says, as a teacher of ultra-Orthodox girls, I was able to see that they did not share their experiences. The world of emotions, to feel anger or doubt, was difficult for them because there is no developed emotional discourse. To give space to unpleasant emotions, it can be a challenge for them. It is true that one must love and not get angry, but it is impossible to be detached from what one feels. So we grow disconnected and distant and suffering children who walk as a herd. The risk is that if I'm connected to myself and I don't like something and I'm less submissive, more rude, less accepting of authority because I'm more connected to myself, can be a challenge and a conflict. On the other hand, it's really a problem that young girls go with the feeling that they only must do what is necessary and acceptable. So you can feel a little bit the conflict here. So let's go to the lower one. Referring to breath as an anchor can be a conflict because it's a disconnection from the real anchor, the reference to God. Instead of turning to God, turning to the body, a kind of new anchor. I feel for myself that in some cases I turn to the body and I don't need anything else. It's sometimes problematic. Okay, so this is a dilemma for a very ultra-religious person. From Ethiopian participant, this whole world of mental difficulties in all this is some kind of taboo or something shameful. It's a shame to talk about emotions and listen to my body. Of course, she said that was before, now it's different. Kindness is a supreme value in our community. It defines us. How can kindness happen? Only if we have feelings. She was saying this in regard to mindfulness being about that feelings are feelings and thoughts are thoughts. You don't have to get attached to them. They don't define you. But if they tell me now that emotions are just a guest, then you are taking away from me the most important thing, to be kind. This is a theme that came up from the Ethiopian community a lot. Kindness is something that defines the community. So this needs to be explained. Apropos community, we define ourselves with the concept of emotion and thoughts. A supreme value is kindness. That's why when I'm told to be compassionate, I don't understand it because I'm always compassionate. It made me realize that we're compassionate to others, but not to ourselves. Okay, so this is, maybe last quote and then I'll summarize. The West calls it mindfulness. In Ethiopian culture, they call it something else, but it exists. The unprivileged populations don't use the term mindfulness, not because they don't know it's called that. Listening, mindfulness, or listening to one's inner self, it's not a language they know, but they do it. The buna, which is a traditional Ethiopian coffee ceremony, the contemplations, there's that already in the culture. Just because they took an ancient philosophy, Buddhism, gave it a beautiful name in the West, it doesn't mean that the population don't know. The buna is a coffee ritual, sitting and listening for a second, how my day went. You are really present, and it is also a way to communicate with family and neighbors. Okay? So I think this is the beginning, and the question is really how to develop these the understanding that what many of them are doing, what many of the groups are doing, actually is already mindfulness, and it has science supported and encouraged to do it. Because, for example, the Buna Tali that passed away, she said to me, after I came to your mindfulness course, I understood that we threw away a lot of really great things of our community, and it made me want to go back to these things. Okay, so I want to end with this slide and say that I think that when we talk about working also both in the field of reconciliation and peacemaking, and also when we're trying to bring mindfulness to various communities, I think we really need to get a deeper understanding of the difference between mindfulness as relief and mindfulness as engagement. Because relating to the question that was there before about how sometimes we don't want it to be a plaster, right? We don't want the mindfulness just to become a relief without the activism that's sometimes needed to go out and do something. We want to be able to disengage in order to engage, not only in order to just calm ourselves down. And I think that this is a place where I would say that the field of mindfulness should go forward. This is a place that my lab is really interested in. I also have to say that a lot of this work was done, we've been doing it with not a lot of money, and unfortunately after the COVID came in and all the changes that happened in the world, everything is free. Suddenly we had this Robin Hood model. We took from people in Tel Aviv, full tuition, and helped, and this supported our work. But now it's much more challenging, and I really hope that we will also, all of us will also be able to find funding opportunities of people that are interested in really seeing how mindfulness goes into social activism and supporting projects. Yeah, and I want to thank my group that I really try to create diversity in our group, and I want to thank them for creating a brave space. I learned that it's better to say a brave space than a safe space, because we can't really have a space, but we can have a brave space. So, yeah, and yeah. So thank you very much, and thank you for doing this day, and I think putting this need to go out to the world as an agenda for the new steps. I think we need it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. And I think we can do the one question from the room and one question from Zoom, and then we'll have to do the wrap up for the day. But I do want to give people the chance to engage with that wonderful talk you just shared. Do we have a question from the room? Sure.
I was curious why most of the participation was female.
I think you mean in the cultural adaptation projects? Yeah. This goes together with the fact that talking about emotions, being vulnerable, is not something that one of the quotes that I didn't do. This matter of sharing, sharing in a group. Many times people from the community feel it's not acceptable to reveal what you feel and you think you leave this at home. My brothers would never participate in such a program. To share, especially what is not good, presents you as weak. I'm different. I didn't grow up at home. Okay, but this is the answer to your question, I think. But I think it happens all the time, and I think sometimes women are the first adapters, but then men come. We also see men, but less.
Thank you. One question from Zoom. We're going to put them up on the screen for you.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. My name is Shiden. I just want to ask and thank you for the presentation, especially for bringing the Bunna as a kind of mindfulness practice. I came from that background, from Ethiopia and Eritrea, actually. So I just want to ask, I have good interest on mindfulness and kind of the contemplative practice. So in regard to the ultra-Orthodox culture, if you have any study of that, as I have grown up in that, it has a similar kind of culture and practice as the contemplative practice of Buddhism and the mindfulness. So have you studied that, or have you seen any similarity? You have mentioned some of them, like the Bunna practice and also the other practices. So have you studied anything with that? And thank you for studying and bringing this intercultural in the mindfulness and the contemplative practice.
Yeah, so I agree with you that he's over there, right? Excuse me if I talk like that. Yeah, I would really, really love to do a study where we actually study the effects, the mental health effects of the Bunna. And this is one of the things we were intending to do with Tali that passed away. And, you know, I'm trying to find another person from the community that would like to be involved in this. As I said, my impression is also from my students from the community. There's so much stress in the life and not a lot of availability to go beyond that it's sometimes difficult to do these things quickly. But I agree with you that for me, the dream is to take the Bunna, to have someone from the community take the Bunna. This is what Tali wanted to do, to take the Bunna, take the science, be able to describe the Bunna with the scientific understanding, and then help, and then see if it really has a positive effects. Now I have actually, from the Arab community, I have a student who's doing his thesis in clinical psychology, and he wants to do something similar, but with Muslim prayers, which he finds from his experience that have a lot of, also a lot of parallels to mindfulness states. So hopefully he will be able also to move this forward. I agree with you that this is something that should be done. Maybe you want to do it.
Yeah, I would. Thank you. And also,
no, I'm talking seriously. If you want to collaborate with me on this, I'm really happy.
Yes, I can collaborate. Of course, I can collaborate because I have grown up. I know the effect, the similarity and the effect, and the Bunna, and also the religious practice, the Orthodox religious practice in the cultural. Even the cultural and the practices, the prayers that are done on the Orthodox side, there are similarities that I have seen very clearly in the Buddhist practice. All the practices that are done in the Buddhist are similar in the manner and in the how the way they do.
Yeah, a lot of gratitude.
I saw the similarity.
Yeah. Yes. I learned a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, I can keep in contact, yeah.
I'll be happy.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
A way to end the day with a new collaboration made right in front of us. I'm going to hand it over to Cliff, Ron, whoever's closing it out for us. Thank you so much.
Wow. Which is a quote from John Kabat-Zinn, who just emailed me. He's been with us all day. Thank you, Nava. I'm very full. I think most of us are. We're overflowing. If you study retreats for a living, you tend to recreate them in your research projects. and in your day-long conferences. So it's not surprising that this is a long day of sitting. But first and foremost, I have to acknowledge my extraordinary team of Quinn, Alea, and Brandon over here. When we were presented with the opportunity to envision a meeting like this, there was essentially a half-hour creative emergence that put the structure of this together and the people we wanted. So we have been prepotently organizing this meeting for many years. We just didn't know it. So I want to, when you do something like this in a beautiful space with the technology, I'm a gearhead and a nerd, and I like complicated things, and here we are creating an international multicultural collaboration on the fly at the send-off moment, made possible by deciding that hybridity is also reality and continuity of connection, right? That was this thing Amishi talked about. So, so if I can't see without my computer glasses. I want to acknowledge here. Let's just close.
Can I say a thing while you're bringing that up?
Mm-hmm.
Is this one on? Yeah. So as Cliff gets ready to invite our gratitude here, I want to connect back to this morning when we set our intention of what brought us here today, and maybe think about something or someone that helped you get here and participate in this moment of contact that we all experienced today. I think I'm really exhausted, but this has been an amazing and really, really rich day. And thank you so much for coming here and for all of the causes and conditions that allowed this moment to happen.
So okay. So the production values that you've all been immersed in would not have been possible without the extraordinarily generous support of both the Tianqiao Chen Chrissy Chen Institute, which Jan represented this morning, and Ron, spontaneously out of the generosity of his immense heart, kicking in funds from the Center for Mind and Brain, which turned out to be absolutely crucial in fixing the gap between our dreams and what we were given. And the technical back end of this is actually immense. If you look around at this, rock concert kind of technology that we have up there, down here. So the Mandavi, so we have, first off, our research assistants and collaborators from our lab, Jacob Fernandez and Jessica Meisman, Alexander Mudd, and Savannah Vanderhoef. They've been running this for us. I'm getting a little hoarse, but pay it no mind. The Mondavi Center staff has been instrumental in helping me understand what it is to actually become a transition from a neuroscientist to an event planner. Our stage manager, Daniel Brem, Herb Garmans, Kirby Hatano, Alex Lin, Carl Metz, Alex Prue, Rudy Rodriguez, and Ricky Tam, who's been in the back making all of this work seamlessly. There are academic technical services, Genevieve Bowman, Bert Craig, Chris Nagelli, who has been on cameras at Pont, Jeremy Polus, TJ Ushing, and Dan has been the Zoom meister. Just making it possible to be these walls fall away and wherever anyone is, anywhere in the world, and then they're here with us. We've had wonderful catering staff from Olive and Vine. Jason Bright and Pia Marie Wright helped organize and make suggestions, because this isn't exactly what I have much background in. And Chef Caesar, sous chef Barry, and Liesa cooks, Cindy, Carson, Zaina, and Martin were our setup team. And for the yellow cluster from the admin of the Center for Mind and Brain, Wilson Zhu, Talene Ledisma. The UC development team, Marina Tan Harper and Alicia Findley. I hope they're still here. And we have 3 Chen Writing Fellows who will provide a most articulate and opinionated piece on the day in the next 3 weeks that will be posted on the Chen Institute website. Alexander Mudd, Jessica Meisman, and Savannah Vandebos. We couldn't give you all gift bags, but we went to great lengths to make name tags. So if you haven't picked up your badge, now's the time. And I just want to close with a simple pointing of gratitude for the depth of wisdom and experience of our extraordinary group of presenters who really were our dream team, our first choice when we envisioned this. Each person and what they have come and brought and what they have emanated in dialogue and reciprocity and resonance with this full community. So I'll just take a few moments of settling in to float out. Thank you all so much. And thank you in Zoom land for hanging in.